Good afternoon, everybody. I think we'll make a start. For those who don't know me, my name's Rowan Wilkin. I'm a research fellow in DIRC and Media and Communication here at RMIT, and it's my great pleasure to introduce Haiqing Yu. Before I do that, I just want to state that RMIT University acknowledges the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations as the traditional owners of the land on which the university stands. RMIT University respectfully recognises elders both past and present. So as I say, it's my great pleasure to introduce Associate Professor Haiqing Yu, our newly minted Vice-Chancellor's Principal Research Fellow in Media and Communication here at RMIT. Haiqing's research focuses on China's digital media, communication and culture and their socio-political and economic impacts in China, Australia and the Asia-Pacific. Her books include Media and Cultural Transformation in China and Sex in China. Haiqing is currently either wrapping up or working on 3 ARC discovery projects. Internet History in Australia and the Asia-Pacific with Mark McClellan and Jared Goggin. Digital China from Cultural Presence to Innovative Nation with Michael Keane and others. And Chinese Language, Digital and Social Media in Australia with Wanning Sun, which, putting my other hat on as board member of Media International Australia, keep an eye out for a future issue that this project will feed into. So those introductions aside, I'm very excited to have Haiqing here at RMIT and to follow your research as it develops over the coming years, and very excited to hear more about your research now. So I think Haiqing's going to talk for about half an hour and it'll be followed by Q&A at the end. So please make Haiqing welcome.
Thank you, my colleagues, my new colleagues. I came to Melbourne almost 20 years ago as a postgraduate student. I did my PhD at Melbourne University. So now I'm back to my camp and back to RMIT. I say back because I tutored for Chen Ju Huang. When he started at RMIT, I was his tutor in teaching in the Asian media course. So I'm back to RMIT. I had my career in Hobart and Sydney. I especially spent lots of time at the University of New South Wales. My research, as Ronan has introduced, focuses on Chinese digital media, culture and communication. I used to look at those social, political and cultural aspects of Chinese media and communication within China, but increasingly I have looked at Chinese language, digital media and communication outside China, particularly with the rise of China and its going out initiatives. And since I live in Australia, as Australian Chinese, I'm also involved in the current debate on the increasing Chinese influence in Australia, and hence our ARC-DP project on the Chinese digital language media in Australia, the debate on Chinese citizenship and soft power. I'll come back to that later. Anyway, Dan Sheila mentioned many years ago, I think it's in 2008, there are 2 poles in today's digital capitalism. One is China, and the other is information and communication industry. And my research touches on both. And my role my identity as Chinese, I lived in China for many years, and I haven't lived in China for nearly 20 years. So I'm both an insider and an outsider. Understand the cultural nuance as a Chinese who speaks Chinese Mandarin as a native language. And also understand the cross-cultural communication, particularly with the increasing Chinese influence and presence in Asia-Pacific, in Australia especially. And that makes me ideally positioned to carry out a serious research regarding the current debates on what's happening in China and what the impact of China's rise globally, and what's the role of digital intermediaries such as the famous BAT, so Baidu, Alibaba, Tencent, particularly Alibaba and Tencent, the 2 digital platforms or the IT big big companies, corporations, whatever you call them. They can be platforms, but actually I would argue they are building infrastructures. But anyway, so particularly with those digital representatives going out since 2000, but increasingly now we have seen with the Chinese government's initiative, since 2009, the Chinese President Hu Jintao called for the Chinese power, Chinese media companies to go out. And since 2015, the current President Xi Jinping, well, we're all familiar with his initiative, the One Belt, One Road initiative, which pulls together the piecemeal outgoing initiative that already started by those digital intermediaries since the early 2000s. So we know those companies have been investing heavily in Southeast Asia, increasingly in Australia, and also in Central Asia. So my focus is on Asia Pacific and Australia. Okay, so there are three key tenets in my research, which I come back to from time to time, or even just constantly. One is the centrality of the state and hegemony of the Chinese Communist Party. Well, not just in Chinese media governance, but also in its operation. So we all know the Chinese media are owned, operated by the Chinese government. We all know there's no freedom of speech, there's no free press in China. But what about those internet companies, those Chinese social media? For example, WeChat is so popular among the Chinese communities everywhere in the world. As if you are Chinese and you don't use WeChat, you're not regarded as Chinese at all. And anybody who does anything to do with China will have to use WeChat to communicate with the Chinese counterpart. I talk to people in Australia, those local Australians. I'll talk to people from Taiwan, from Hong Kong, who used to use Facebook, WhatsApp, Line, etc. And now they use WeChat as well as part of their, repertoire of all the apps on their phones. So the role of digital capitalists, the intermediaries, and in these Chinese going out strategies needs to be assessed, and particularly its impact at local markets. It's not just what they do, but how they are viewed and received. And so that's part of my research. But what I'm more interested in finding out the intertwined relationship between the state and intermediaries. Okay, so are they truly private independent? And what's the role in their going out strategies when we look at the centrality of the Chinese state and hegemony of the CCP? So that's one key tenet in my research. And the second is the historicity and the controversies of the so-called Chinese dream. Dating as far as the Silk Road in the Tang and the Song dynasty about 2,000 years ago, and as close as in 2015 when Xi Jinping proposed the One Belt, One Road initiative, we know that this kind of the drive for national rejuvenation, the drive to be in the center of the world stage, again, underpins lots of the activities that China and its representatives have been taking. We know the One Belt, my research doesn't focus on One Belt, One Road, but I have to talk about it. I have to use that as a background research. And we know that it's a massive infrastructure project, also dubbed as the high-speed railway diplomacy. It's aimed to open new markets, to upgrade Chinese industry, and to promote development in central and the western provinces. And this a more coherent vision than ever before by the modern Chinese government to have its digital, but also its infrastructural footprints around the world. But at the same time, we have known that it has spawned a new Cold War of infrastructure building, as well as the revival of the so-called yellow perils panic and the so-called silent invasion of Chinese money and power. I'll come back to this later, but this touches upon the third tenet in my research, that is the local, translocal dimension in my research. Okay. I haven't talked about these slides. So my research from the very beginning, even when I was focusing on China, has been looking at the intersectionality between the internet and alternate. Because the internet used to be, so important, the centrality of everybody's hot keywords. But increasingly we realize actually it's only just a small part of one's world, our lives. Because our lives are intersectioned in so many other networks. Because we don't live just on the internet, right? Internet is just part of our life. So I look at the intersectionality of the internet and alternates of digital media and communication and human communication. Eventually, it comes to my training at Melbourne University. That's in the cultural studies. So I did my PhD in media and cultural studies. So increasingly, I have to go back to my training in cultural studies to understand, the technology, the digital part of issue from the social cultural perspective. And hence, the focus on class, the revival of class, has also been the revival of class and nationalism. I haven't written down nationalism in this slide, have been central when we look at China's rise and its integration into the transnational circuits of capitalist production and consumption. The issue of class and the class struggle has been featured prominently in lots of scholarship, particularly from the political economy perspective. Leading scholars like Yue Zhizhao, Jack Chu, and my colleague Wan Ying Sun have used a mixture of Marxism and Foucauldian perspectives to analyze the role of media and communication in the reconstruction of class and other dimensions of power knowledge paradigm. Under such a paradigm, I also look at the eruption of the social in the Hu Jintao era, and now the repression of the social in the Xi Jinping era. So I look at the policy level, the digital intermediaries, but also at the grassroots level to look at the users or the consumers or the citizens, whatever you call them. So the three levels are intertwined in my research. So when I look at the eruption and now the suppression of the social, I focus on gender, sexuality, disability, and ethnicity. Those are, the familiar identity categories. It's useful to slice them down. It's just like when we, as China study scholars, when we look at China, it's such a huge country, and it's more useful to tear it apart and slice down into different Chinas. And similarly with the internet and the media communication system, it's also useful to tear it apart and pull it apart and tear it down to look at certain sections in order to have a more nuanced and deeper understanding of what's going on. For example, when I look at gender, I look at the e-commerce, the rise of e-commerce in China, and is the role of gender, and particularly women. And I did field work in the last few years. I went to rural areas, went to the so-called Taobao villages. Taobao, owned by Alibaba, is like similar to Amazon, eBay, but it's much bigger than those Western models. So I look at how the use of e-commerce by those rural villages have changed the village structure and governance. I also look at women's involvement in rural e-commerce to look at whether economic empowerment has been translated or can be translated into political and cultural enablement. Unfortunately, so far the funding is still disappointing because women are still not involved and represented in the village governance. And the traditional patriarchal structure that governs the rural villages and still subordinates women to the rule of the patriarchal family structure and village structure and also the political structure. So I have a recent article being almost accepted by China Quarterly. They said well, we're still waiting for the final decision from the editor, but I've gone through the 2 revisions process. I hope, fingers crossed, oh, okay. Okay, basically, I look at the role of women. That's one example to show my focus on gender, and gender at the intersection of ICT and e-commerce, digital economy. Okay, I would like to have a comparative analysis to examine how ICT and e-commerce is articulated to transform, reconfigure, or reproduce power structures at both individual and collective levels in different national settings. And this is something that I haven't done yet. Okay, increasingly my research has moved from urban. When I look at sexuality, sex in China, when I wrote that book, it's a very sexy topic. Lots of people ask me, oh, sex in China. I said, I'm not expert on sex, but I look at, I look at youth sexuality, homosexuality, gay lesbians, and how they have been represented and treated in Chinese media and society. Anyway, so increasingly now, I have moved from the urban to rural areas, from users to infrastructure, to look at the bigger picture, and of course, from national to transnational. Okay, apart from the rural e-commerce and the gender perspective, another one also along the line of, the intersection of social and digital technology is the project I'm working with Gerard Gogan, Karen Fisher, to examine the digital economies of disability. And we ask 2 key questions. One, how is the concept and the practice of digital economy of disability understood in different national contexts? 2, what lessons can be drawn from the disability field that are relevant to capacity building and social inclusion for other traditionally disadvantaged groups of people? We have, in the group, I have, disability studies experts whose focus is on Australia, and me and another colleague will be looking at Australia, and then we draw the comparative perspective together. This is something that we are still in the process of developing, hopefully into a linkage grant in the near future. For my part, I'm interested in writing a book. I don't know, maybe a 5-year plan. This is my tentative title, to look at this disability as exception, digital economy of disability in China. I will be giving a talk later this year at Melbourne University in their Chinese Studies seminar to focus on this topic. I will be able to report more on my finding. Basically, it's a political economy perspective to look at digital economy and disability, and how the digital entrepreneurs with disabilities are used as a poster boys and girls in China's wish to soften and harmonize its image as internationally as an authoritarian party state that censors and suppresses freedom of speech. And of course, there's a lack of equality, etc. But disability has been treated as exception, and how that is done. So that's the book, that's the research that I will be working at, and hopefully we'll get our LP application going. And the tentative title for that project, I just patted my head the other day and came up with it. It's called Employable Me, Digital Economy and Disability in China and Australia. Hopefully, we'll get some industry partners to help us. Okay, another top project is the one that is a collaborative project that's related to my previous research, but it also helps me to actually expand my research parameter from China and Australia to other parts of Asia Pacific. And that's the Digital China project, working with Michael Kim from Curtin University. We just had our ethics approved. We have been doing a large-scale survey, particularly to have an understanding of how Chinese cultural products are understood, consumed, and received, assessed by people in Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore, and Australia. And up to last weekend, I think we'll have nearly 400 responses. But we're going to have it run for another 2 more weeks, and then we'll go through the analysis stage. So if I were giving to this talk later this year, I will be able to tell you more about the survey result, but I can't do it at the moment. Okay, so as part of the project, we're going to work on cultural power metric. We don't know how it looks like yet. Metric. We don't know how it looks like yet, but we will have to get there by the end of the next 3 years. We will have one co-authored book, one co-edited book, and a string of journal articles. I'm currently leading an article with the team on the expansion of Chinese digital capitalists in Asia Pacific, with a focus on Alibaba. So for a special journal issue on the platformization of Chinese media. So what I'm going to argue is that Alibaba is not just a platform. It's a string of platforms. And actually, it should be viewed as an infrastructure builder, institution changer, not just platform. So I'm still working on that. Okay, so that's one project. Another ARC-DP project is the one working with Wanning from UTS, which is very topical. To look at Chinese language, digital, social media in Australia, rethinking soft power. So we have just submitted our ethics application. We are recruiting an RA to help us do some quantitative research. We will be examining institutional account, meaning the Chinese language, digital, social media in Australia. Who are they? Who are the founders? Who are the journalists? How is it operated? Not from funding to operation to its marketing strategies and its engagement with the Chinese diaspora in Australia. And then we'll do the content analysis. And of course, we'll also have focus groups and individual interviews to have this longitudinal ethnography of media use. The focus, of course, is on Chinese migrants. Wanning and I both first-generation Chinese migrants in Australia. We are part of the community. We have connection with the Chinese community. We're looking at the Chinese from mainland China mainly, okay? And we look at their use and the production of digital social media. So I hope I will be able to report more on this project next year. So we're doing a survey from mid this year, and then next year I'll be very happy to have another talk to the school. And I'll be very busy writing more. So journal articles, special issue with Mia, fantastic, thank you, Ronan. And a co-author book with Wanning and, opinion pieces and media interviews. We have already started those. I have to be very careful about how to respond to media interviews on this topic, because it's such a controversial issue. And me as a Chinese, who's not Chinese citizen, is difficultly positioned in such current debate. And Wanning and I both feel the debate needs to be healthier to enable balanced and diversified views on the topic. And the national security issue should be separated from the multicultural issue. Okay, that's our part of our opinion piece debate. All right, another DP project which has already been completed is on the internet history in Australia and Asia Pacific with Gerard Gog and Mark McDilland. We did that from 2009 to 2016 with a string of articles and co-edited books. Okay, apart from those bigger projects, I also have other 2 more projects which I'm passionate about. There are ways, I put this as a potential book. I haven't written that yet. I haven't even started the book proposal, but it's a way to summarize and pull together what I have done in the past. And this book is called Free Lunch Sans Frontiers, the global outreach of Chinese philanthropy and the social media. The free lunch is a charity initiative by an investigative journalist called Deng Fei. And he turned to be a private entrepreneur, a philanthropist. I'd call him entrepreneur because to run a charity organization or philanthropic organization is not dependent on your passion. It's on your management skill. And he runs his charity organization as an industry, as an enterprise. So he had this all started from social media, from Weibo, facilitated on Weibo, and now increasingly WeChat. But it's just not just a Chinese thing. It has international outreach. 2 weeks ago, Deng Fei came to Australia, to Melbourne, at the invitation of an Australian local Chinese charity organization. It's called the China Education Foundation. And I went there. And this is just one of the many events the Free Lunch organization has been doing internationally, particularly in North America and Europe. It's the first time for them to come to Australia. And I wanted to find out, is not just the birth and the growth of Free Lunch, which I have already done and published on, but also more how the Chinese philanthropy and the charity initiatives have been engaging internationally with not just local Chinese, but also local communities, because Free Lunch has its African footprint. It has gone to Nigeria. It would be interesting to see what's the motivation for this privately owned, it's no longer private owned because it has to be registered with a government-sponsored charity organization in order to raise funds publicly now. But it started as a grassroots, illegal organization, and now has grown to be a transnational organization. What are the actors involved? What's the motivation for them to go overseas? We know they come here to attract more donations. Straightforward, but it's more than that. So I wanted to look at that. And the role of social media, of course, is always central to my inquiry. Okay. Next is another one is about Chinese internet celebrity. Last week, I was interviewed by ABC to talk about Wang Hong, meaning internet hot red, meaning those celebrity who's able to turn their fame into profit, particularly through the Taobao platform. I have been examining Chinese opinion leaders on Weibo. I've been looking at the rise of internet celebrity from the blogging era to the microblogging era. But now increasingly we have those, short video sharing websites, the apps have, Taobao, of course, has an inbuilt video sharing function, and how those live streaming, microblogging, and WeChat, instant messaging, and other string of, apps have been used by those celebrity wanted to be in China to transform their followers into consumers and the global impact, the global reach of those phenomena, the Wang Hong industry. So it's not just an individual action, it's a whole string of actors involved. It's professionalized. Last Sunday, there was a competition in Melbourne. It's called Wang Hong competition, meaning the internet celebrity competition among the Chinese community here. I was surprised to see it has moved to Australia. Impact on the Chinese young students who have been studying in Australia, who are studying in Australia, in Melbourne. So that this is what I'll be looking at. That reminds me, I should probably work on this book first, because the media is very interested in this. And the journalist who interviewed me said, "You should write a book on this." I said, "Yes, I am thinking about it." And she said, "You should prioritize it." I said, "Oh, maybe I should." And so I came up with the title just, last week, The Culture and Economy of Internet Celebrity in China. Okay. So to summarize, my research has been moved from looking at Chinese media as practice, as culture or communication, and from looking at the intertwining logics of the state and the market. I have moved away from examining dichotomy of the state and the society in China to look at the conceptual and the normative paradigm of democracy and how democracy is understood globally. In the Chinese context, when we look at democracy, it's not just about whether the Chinese have the right to vote, whether they have the freedom to elect a president or to have freedom of speech, because it's out of the question. But under the current situation, what means in a Chinese way as progress? And here's my focus on the social. So to look at the key players in such a game. So moved away from the simplistic paradigms to look at media cultural communication, to tell the story of China's social transformation in China and its global engagement through the prism of media and communication. With attention to time, we have to look at its socialist legacy. What happened in Mao era has kept being recalled upon. Okay? Space, online and offline. Geography, the trans-China dimension, and the culture. And those are, we understand, are the fundamental dimensions of human communication. So increasingly, I find myself working with colleagues from a whole range of disciplines, as we all do. Anthropologists, sociologists, political scientists, historians, philosophers, and colleagues from information systems, business, and to have a better understanding actually of what China is, what it is becoming, and its role in our digitized and networked realities. Okay, I think, that's an introduction to my research. Thank you.
Many thanks, Haiqing. It's great to hear about your research and a fairly ambitious but exciting program of research for your time in the coming years. What I neglected to mention at the outset was that this is the first in a series of lunchtime seminars introducing some of the new VC fellows who are aligned with Dirk to colleagues here at RMIT. So thanks, Haiqing, for being prepared to be the first one to give one of these talks. We've got a little bit of time for some questions, so just put up your hand and we'll do the roving mic thing and you can ask your question.
Thanks so much for your presentation. It was really good to get a bit more of a kind of deep view of the things that you're looking at. I'm wondering, with Alibaba moving into the game space, is that something that is taking up your current or your future research at all?
Yes. I have
new stuff. This has only happened in the past sort of few months, but as you say, Alibaba is such a big player, and I know that the Tennyson and NetEase are quite concerned because they've really owned that space in China, and Alibaba's just moved in.
Yeah. I have written an article which has been accepted by Media Industries Journal to look at the rise of Chinese esports empire, with a focus on Alibaba, the competition between Alibaba and the Tencent. So increasingly, we don't talk about bet anymore, but just focus on Alibaba and Tencent. We know increasingly those two companies are cross-fertilizing. Well, they're not cross-fertilizing each other, but they are competing with each other in almost every single field, from e-commerce, which is Alibaba's strength, to entertainment, which is the Tencent's area of dominance, to music, literature, and of course esports gaming. And Tencent still dominates in mobile gaming, and Ali has a huge money, lots of money, threw in lots of money, has the highest prize money for esports competition, for example, and is building the esports town, turning the whole town into the esports park. It has a esports university, esports park, esports entertainment park, whatever. The whole town is themed around esports. And it's not just doing that in China, but also has as I said, transnational dimension. It has the money to recruit South Korean players, for example, to play in China. It has money to buy South Korean esports companies. And they still keep their original names. If you look at who are the owners, you find in recent years, they have become Chinese. So yeah, it has become my recent focus as part of my Digital China project to look at the Chinese digital expansion, digital capitalist expansion in Asia Pacific. Yeah, but I would not say I'm an expert in that. Now, I've done the survey of the field, and then the next step is to look more details into what's happening there, particularly industry part.
Thank you for the talk. Sorry, is this one? I was just wondering, speaking on from that last comment with the expanding beyond national borders and that kind of thing, has there been much of a push to try to recruit other people that don't speak Mandarin or Cantonese? Are these platforms moving beyond that sphere at all?
The recruit of the Chinese people who can speak Mandarin.
So has there been any movement to try to push into other markets, so beyond people who speak Chinese?
Oh, yeah. Yes. Yeah, there has been. The first focus is, of course, among the Chinese-speaking communities, the Chinese diasporas, and use those Chinese diasporas as the boats. You know, the famous Chinese saying to borrow a boat to go overseas, coming from the Sunzi, the art of war, Sunzi Bingfa. When you don't have the venue, you borrow the boat, meaning foreign channels, when it comes to satellite broadcasting, you buy the time slots and you buy the channels. And when it comes to digital media, you use the Chinese diaspora in Western countries. But that has been done. It has been done. If you look at the last 10 years, lots of people look at Confucius Institute. That's only a small section of what the Chinese government has been doing. The Chinese government and the state-sponsored media organizations have been doing. But increasingly now they have extended their tentacles into non-Chinese speaking parts of the world, recruiting not necessarily Chinese speaking people, but the local people to localize, to have the so-called localized face, and therefore local people won't be suspicious of the Chinese presence, especially now, as I mentioned before, the Chinese money and the power has been causing lots of controversies around the world. In Australia, is a typical example. Their expansion in Africa and their incorporation of local companies in the telecommunication industry is a typical example. And in my current research on the digital China, to look at Chinese digital capitalism expansion in Asia Pacific, I look at Alibaba, for example, to look at how it has bought the local Indian e-commerce payment platform. And in Singapore, they bought Lazada, what's it called? Yeah, the local e-commerce platform, and in Malaysia as well. So they have, of course, in Singapore, Malaysia, they have huge number of Chinese-speaking people there, but not in India. And this focus is not just on the Chinese-speaking communities. So, yeah, we'll be able to report more after we finish this project or into 2 more years into this project.
Thank you.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes. Thanks for just a really interesting survey of all of those areas. It's a fascinating sort of panorama of the research possibilities in the space that you're in. One thing I was kind of wondering about, following in a way from Sam's comments is, the big digital platforms that we know in the West. One of the things about them is that they've been extraordinarily profitable. So they've been incredibly lucrative businesses, and that's been partly to do with the fact that we've seen a kind of almost a winner-take-all kind of dynamic in a lot of these markets. So in search or in certain sorts of social media, we tend to see the emergence of a dominant player, which has sort of taken market share transnationally incredibly successfully. This has given rise to all sorts of policy debates in places like Australia about how do we, precisely the sort of the key point that you framed at the beginning, the relationship between the state and these businesses and these platforms. So in particular, at the moment in Australia, there's a lot of discussion about taxation, about how do we capture some of the value of the transactions that have moved from traditional businesses into these new spaces. And as you say, the Chinese digital platforms are now moving into these markets in a very large way, and they're being very successful beyond their traditional kind of market in the diaspora. So I'm sort of wondering a bit about whether there is a debate in China about the taxation of these businesses, given that they are, generally speaking, so lucrative and so important from an economic point of view, and because, of course, tax is always politically contentious in every political system, and in China as elsewhere. And I suppose your sense also of how these arguments might play out, where we start to see countries like Australia, European jurisdictions and others trying to assert some regulatory control over revenue flows within these businesses and these large transnational platforms which are based elsewhere. And so this is a kind of obviously a major issue between Australia and the United States, where the big Western platforms are hosted. But could this be also an emerging area of tension or debate between jurisdictions around the control of the platforms you're talking about?
This is a master question. Really good, and which actually prompts me to think about what I'm doing in a higher level. Okay. I have to admit that I haven't done research at the level that you have just talked about to look at the taxation of the digital platforms, the taxation issue.
Yeah.
I know from what I've read that it has been an issue of key debates, and there are regulations and the laws that have been issued to address the issue within the Chinese context, but I haven't looked into the issue closely. And another issue is about the regulatory control of those, different companies or platforms belonging to different jurisdictions and how they talk to each other. I think it will be great to look into that. What I would like to add on what I'm not answering your question, but I would like to add is when we look at this relation between the state and the digital private companies, we have to mention the Chinese internet censorship, how that has benefited the rise and the growth of those Chinese digital platforms. Without banning of Google, YouTube, Twitter, there wouldn't be WeChat, there wouldn't be Weibo, there wouldn't be even other string of platforms. The protective policies within China helped the growth of domestic digital empires. And it's those major Western platforms, digital platforms, are still banned in China, but Chinese digital platforms have the free go any way they want. So that's the background that needs to be pointed out. And when it comes to taxation, etc., I think, I'll have to look into that issue. Sorry. Yeah, it is interesting to look at the debates, what's happening in China, what Chinese say about it. Okay, you have exposed the weakness of my research. That is the theoretical contribution to scholarship. I've been in a teaching research combined position for a long time, and coming to RMIT to take up this research fellow position gives me the opportunity to actually sit down and sit back to look at what I've done, rather than just being busy, going. That's what I have been doing since I finished my PhD. So, given this talk, it's a good opportunity for me to sit down to look at what I've done, to put them together in these, circles. But when it comes to the theoretical contribution to scholarship, particularly in the area of gender, I don't think I have made any significant contribution. I have to be frank with that, because I've been drawing on feminist political economy perspective to look at gender and e-commerce. And I've been reading, existing literature on that. But I think if my contribution probably will lie on how my incorporation of the history part into looking at what's happening now. In other words, I look backwards to look at what has been happening now. When I look at e-commerce in China and its women's role, I look at the Mao era and the immediately post-Mao era, in the early years of reform era in China in the early 1980s, the courtyard economy in those days when women were mobilized to raise pigs, chickens, etc., or to sow, etc., in their courtyard, to contribute to the household economy and the village economy, and how that has been revived in the e-commerce era. And it's also these women who are mobilized to use the internet. But mostly you see those women, single mothers, left behind mothers and the children and the grandparents to work in their courtyards to, basically involved in the e-commerce. And I look at what has happened before, now has been revived, and what are the new form. And then by doing that, I add the historical perspective to the current debate on the political economy of gender.
Thanks so much, Haiqing. I've got two questions, actually. And I mean, social media research has been, there's such an interesting and fast-moving conversation around methods as well too, and there's a kind of coexistence of a range of different ways of knowing about social media that are all kind of fighting for attention at the moment, and from political economy methods to digital empirical methods to ethnographic and that kind of thing. So I was really interested to chat with you about where do you think the future of social media research might be going, and what do you find most interesting and that kind of thing. And I was also just really curious to know about the discourses in China around BAT and the major platforms. Like in the West, we've had such a couple of years of reckoning about Facebook and Google and monopoly power and Cambridge Analytica, and there's huge kind of backlash against politically and from consumers around concerns about monopoly, privacy, that kind of thing. Is anything like comparable happening in China?
Okay, yeah, two questions. One about the methods to research social media. This is something that Wan Ying and I and Michael King and I have been working on through our two ARC discovery grants, because traditionally we are also the so-called qualitative researchers. We use interviews, case studies, and a small sample, then we draw analysis and a conclusion. But increasingly we realize, the combination of quantitative and qualitative research is important. We all know that. But how to do it is the key issue. And we are still experimenting it. So we have the large survey going on, and we'll have questionnaires which will be several hundred to thousands people. But then what do we get out of there is still a question. This is my weakness. I like to actually seek advice from my colleagues here who are so experienced in doing social media research. You know, Sarah, their digital ethnography guru. So I would like to actually seek your advice on that. And the second question is about the Chinese discourse around the BAT. In China, I think the discussion there is very different from what's happening in the West. In the West, you know, you see lots of critical analysis on Facebook, Google, Twitter, etc. But in China, the dominant discourse is very nationalistic. So basically is to summarize, make a simple way. Finally, China has its own digital champions that are number one or number two in the world. We are taking over the world. We are taking over Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. So they are the national champions. Partly because of the internet censorship, the media censorship, you don't hear controversial voices. What you hear is that kind of, you know, ultra-nationalistic discourse. That's why in my earlier talk, in the earlier part of my talk, I mentioned not just the concept of class, but also the revival of Chinese nationalism in China, but also in among Chinese diaspora. And, you know, when you look at the Alibaba in Australia, which is the office in the city here in Melbourne, you know, it's all about, look how great we are. Which is, you know, worry. So, thanks.
In the interest of time, I think we'll leave the questions there. I just want to ask that you say thank you once again for Haiqing for her fascinating talk.